delighted to have with us Nate Wilmers, who's here from the MIT Sloan School, and is going to be talking to us about the end of inequality, workplace reorganization amid resurgent worker power. And I forgot to ask, do you want questions along the way or hold?
How do you guys usually, whatever your norm is? So I'm totally happy for you to interrupt me. I feel like sometimes when I present to sociology departments, and they're not used to interrupting, it's like the few aggressive people will ask questions, and then everybody else will wait till the end.
In terms of interrupting.
Great, so jump in at any time then, for sure. That's terrific. And we've got an hour, basically?
An hour and 15.
Cool, okay, super. Thanks so much. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. So basically all my work, I've been working on understanding this chart, which just shows rising earnings inequality in the US. You can see that inequality is increasing like really rapidly in the 1980s, but then increased pretty linearly from the 1980s through the Great Recession. And it's actually, although as I say, I've done a lot of work on this and lots of other people have done a lot of work on it too, descriptively it's actually pretty simple to understand what's going on here, where essentially what you have is you've had pretty rapid pay growth for those at the top of the wage distribution. This is the 90th percentile. It's sort of even faster if you look above the 90th percentile. And then in contrast, for the bottom half of the distribution, you have essentially wage stagnation during this period. Maybe a little bit of growth in the late 90s, but other than that, at the median and at the bottom of the distribution, you have very little wage growth. And now, if unlike me, you're not automatically concerned about rising inequality, maybe you're here because you care a lot about poverty, but not like these relative inequality type measures. Well, this change has really been transformative for US society and the US labor market. So, the Chetty and David Gresky work shows that sort of a big source of declining absolute economic mobility in the US is really rising income inequality. So, if you're in the sort of 1940 cohort, you have about a 90% chance of having a higher income than your parents. If you're a millennial like me, you have about a coin flip, a 50-50 shot of making more income than your parents. So the so-called fading of the American dream. A little bit of it is due to declining GDP per capita growth, declining productivity growth, but the majority of it is actually due to rising inequality. At the same time, we saw in the 1960s through the early 1970s, big progress on the black-white wage gap. It fell roughly in half over like a 15-year period. Then, since the mid-1970s, we've basically seen no progress on this measure, so no progress on racial wage inequality in the last 40 years in the era of DEI and EEO enforcement and all this other stuff. And a big reason for this is rising economic inequality in the labor market overall. So even as black workers are increasingly represented in managerial and professional jobs, the fact that they're still underrepresented in the bottom half of the distribution, and the fact that the top has sort of grown so much faster than that bottom half, has basically erased the progress in racial inequality that we should have expected from the integration of occupations that we've seen. So those two kind of declining absolute mobility and lack of progress on the racial wage gap are, in a sense, they're causally related to rising labor market inequality, but labor market inequality is just sort of like constitutively related to them. This is like two other ways of describing rising labor market inequality. This third thing that I have of populist backlash, this is much more distant, and I think the research here is much shakier. But there's been some nice papers recently showing that some of the same forces that are contributing to rising inequality have also contributed to a bunch of political consequences in the US. So the decline of labor unions has been linked to increased racial animosity, economic globalization linked to support for right-wing populist candidates. So this stuff like a little bit more speculative, but in general, I think there's sort of, it's hard to underestimate the huge impacts that rising labor market inequality has had on the US labor market and US society. And if, like me, these sort of consequences that I'm listing sound like not great consequences, like things that we might be concerned about, then you might be a bit deflated to hear how people talk about rising inequality. So this is a quote from the great Marxist geographer David Harvey. He says, look, increasing social inequality seems to be constitutive of neoliberalism. This seems to be sort of really core to this basic way that we've set up markets and societies since the 1980s. And so, Harvey's a Marxist, that they tend to be pretty pessimistic, think that capitalism's getting worse and worse. But Rebecca Henderson, who teaches at HBS and has an otherwise quite sunny book called Reimagining Capitalism, it's very optimistic. She also says, look, even if a lot of firms came together and raised wages for people in that bottom half of the distribution, this really isn't going to do much to reduce inequality, because there's just like too big of an incentive, too big of a temptation to renege on those commitments, not take the high road, and go back to sort of a low-wage equilibrium. So, whether you talk to Rebecca Henderson or David Harvey, or many of us who study rising inequality, who think about the contribution of declining labor unions, which really, labor union density in the US has been declining since the 1950s. This is like a very long-run secular trend, very hard to reverse. If you think this has a lot to do with skill-biased technological change, you might think that you need some like big increase in the supply of college-educated workers. Well, that's going to take like huge policy changes, a big expansion of higher education, the sort of changes that probably aren't right now politically feasible, or at least like would be really hard to imagine happening. So given all this, you might be pretty pessimistic about this trend, as I and Harvey and Henderson were. So you might also be surprised about what's happening over the last decade, which is essentially that we have not seen rising labor market inequality sometime between 2012 and 2015, and we've looked at this with a bunch of different data sources, a bunch of different inequality concepts, and basically the upshot is that inequality does not seem to have been rising over roughly the last decade. Depending on the source you use, it's either declined pretty significantly, or it at least has not grown much. And this is, includes the pandemic recovery period, but this trend actually predates that a bit too. So what's going on here? Well, in a recent PNAS paper, Clem Apley and I look at this a bunch of different ways and find that a big source of this change in inequality trends is connected to tightening labor markets following the long recovery from the Great Recession. So, there's declining unemployment throughout this period, increasing labor force participation, lots of demand for workers coming back into the labor market. And so in a sense, that's kind of a proximate cause explanation for what's going on here that we endorse. But I'm going to sort of talk about a somewhat different question today, which is more of a predictive question about whether we think that this is actually going to be sustainable, whether we think there's actually been a trend break in rising inequality, or whether we're sort of, with the next recession, going to be back to rising inequality. And specifically, I want to focus in on kind of one channel that might lock in lower inequality, which is sort of firms figuring out ways to reorganize work, especially for relatively low-wage workers, in ways that support higher pay. I'm going to make that a lot more concrete in a second, but let me just zoom out for a minute to give you a little more motivation on this. So this is a different inequality concept. The share of pre-tax national income going to the bottom 50% of Americans. This is sort of a longer historical perspective than the charts I was showing you before. You can see in the 1920s and 1930s, the bottom 50% of Americans are getting about 14% of national income. That abruptly changes with the onset of World War II, spikes up and sort of increases intermittently through this, golden era, 30 years of post-war egalitarian economic growth. Yeah. Yeah, so this is labor plus capital income tax returns base. The previous charts that I was showing you are survey-reported labor earnings from the current population survey, basically. I'm going to show you a little bit with the LEHD, the administrative data, which is basically that's directly payroll-based and is only basically, employers report quarterly earnings for all their workers, and that's going to be only realized dollars, as you say. Okay, but yeah, so this is sort of total income, including capital and labor income, and you can see it's increasing. It peaks at about 21%. Then in the 1970s, it stabilizes, since then drops down, and then you can see sort of our current era here. It's not quite the huge spike that we saw during World War II, but it's sort of noticeably different than what the preceding 30 years look like. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, we know that in World War II, there were also very tight labor markets. You had hundreds of thousands of people fighting in Europe. You had sort of this huge increase in demand as US factories switched to creating munitions and arms to fight this war. But we also saw low unemployment, tight labor markets in the late 1990s, the so-called Clinton boom. And as I mentioned before, we did see earnings increase, but we saw them sort of increase uniformly across the board. So we didn't see a big decline in inequality during this period. Maybe the rising inequality sort of wobbles and pauses a bit, but then we're very quickly back to trend through the Great Recession. So what else was different between World War II and the Clinton boom? Well, basically, in the wake of World War II, 1950s, 1960s, we saw this huge transformation in the employment relationship in the US. This was the rise of industrial labor unions. For the first time, industrial workers had sort of formal collective bargaining representation. We saw kind of the rise of internal labor markets creating career tracks within large firms. We saw sort of a general bureaucratization of employment for the first time in a way that I think somewhat speculatively contributed to locking in these tight labor markets essentially for a generation forward through the 1970s when this kind of employment relations system started to fall apart for a bunch of reasons. So what I'm curious about is basically whether we see something similar happening now. And I think it's pretty clear that we don't see sort of exactly what happened in the 1940s now, and I'll go into that in more detail in a bit. What I'm curious about is whether there's some other ways that firms might be able to reorganize the work that people are doing to support higher wages. Okay, so let me make this more concrete. This is a press release from Walmart that was released a few years ago. They say, hey, look, we're going to change the way we organize things in our stores. We're going to provide more training so that our workers can do sort of a broader range of more complex tasks. We're going to give people more ownership over their work, more autonomy, more discretion over what they're doing. We're really going to change things around. And so what I'm curious about is whether these kinds of changes are actually able to support higher pay. But this is a Walmart press release. I'm coming to you from a business school into a poverty institute talking about this great Walmart press release, which is a little embarrassing given that Walmart is like the poster child for low-wage, anti-union employment in the US. And indeed, that is the right picture of Walmart that you should have if you're looking at 2014. So essentially, this is Walmart. This is sort of distributions of pay for the sort of retail, frontline retail cashier type job. And what you can see is that Walmart is indeed quite low wage. It's at about $8 or $9 an hour here, and it's sort of bringing up this very large left tail of the distribution for these workers. But you can see that there's a really significant change between 2014 and 2022. So this distribution shifts way to the right. It shifts way downward. There's this big spike at $15 an hour that Costco and Target are basically defining this $15 an hour, a legacy of the fight for 15 and all this activism that was happening during this period. And you see Walmart is not at the $15 mark yet, though they just a month ago announced yet another pay increase for their frontline workers. But Walmart has really shifted hugely such that they were in the bottom half of the distribution down here, and now they've sort of moved into the upper half of the distribution at the same time as the mean of the distribution has also moved up a lot. This is all in nominal dollars. If you deflate it, it looks a little less dramatic, but basically we see a really dramatic change in pay for workers at Walmart. And what I want to ask in this talk is basically whether we can generalize from this, whether we can think about work reorganization as something that firms can do to provide higher pay for workers beyond just the Walmart case. One sec. And the way I'm going to do that is basically by doing the first ever match between scraped online job postings and the linked employer-employee data that I mentioned before. What this is going to let us do is basically get really rich descriptions of individual jobs and match them to the people who are hired into those jobs so that we can look within firm by occupation and see whether employers are actually raising wages when they reorganize their work as measured through these job descriptions. Yeah.
Wage per hour was deceptive because they're using just-in-time scheduling or sending people home so that they're paying more per hour, but overall people aren't making more money.
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is like, Danny Schneider and others have really drawn attention to this problem of sort of insecure scheduling in retail and food service. The macro answer is if you look at wage inequality trends and weekly earnings inequality trends, they look very similar. It's not the case that as workers are getting raises, they're getting fewer hours in the aggregate economy-wide. In fact, what we see is the opposite. There's sort of a big decline in part-time work over this period, again, consistent with recovery from the Great Recession, et cetera. It's a good question, though, about Walmart specifically, whether they're changing this. I'll say, some of this I'm going to talk about more in a bit. We have these Glassdoor job review data, which are problematic in a bunch of ways. But the cool thing is you can actually get a little more richness on how workers are talking about their jobs. And the closest thing that you can get to that, they have a Likert scale question saying how is work-life balance in this job, which is tough. It's clearly designed with managers, professionals in mind, but the Walmart workers who fill out these forms also answer this, and arguably it gets at something like scheduling insecurity. And there's improvements on that Likert scale. It's like a half a point basically during this period. So my guess is, so I can say it's not getting worse in the aggregate. My guess is at Walmart, it's also getting a little better, but it's a good question. Great, so that's where we're headed, is to sort of try to think about not just the Walmart case, but think about whether we can study kind of work organization at scale connected to these high quality longitudinal earnings data. And the reason I'm so excited about this is I think very often our questions about labor market dynamics are basically driven by whatever questions happen to be in sort of Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys or other government surveys. So we've studied occupation and industry and education and experience. But there's a lot of, to me, really inspiring work in the sociology of work, basically about forms of workplace control, about the allocation of tasks, that there's a lot of reason to think this should be really important for wage setting, but it's just really hard to study with kind of our standard data sources. So this is why I'm so excited about figuring out sort of alternative sources of data that we can connect to labor market, economy-wide wage information to see whether this sort of often more qualitative, rich research that's been done on work organization might affect these big trends. So that's where we're headed. I've also been thinking about, and this actually connects to Catherine's question, about work intensity. If you read about basically Amazon during this period, they're offering relatively high wages, $15 an hour and up, to work in their warehouses, but it's really intense, grueling work. And so we have another project sort of trying to figure out how much work intensification accounts for this seeming decline in inequality. Not going to have time to get through that today, but is sort of flagging that as part of this project. And so before, though, we get to any of that stuff, just want to spend a little time downloading to you guys everything that I know about the last decade of US labor markets. I'm going to frame that around the question of whether we're basically returning to this 1940s, 1950s low inequality regime. And the answer to that is going to be no, this looks different in some way. Yeah.
On your last slide, I kept thinking about the growth in the EITC.
Yeah.
Essentially a wage supplement for employers.
Yeah.
So I just wondered about the role of that. That would have been different than in the earlier period. And then it makes me think differently about job quality, because if there's increase in the earnings, but if the earnings before would have been enhanced or similar with the EITC. Do you understand what I'm saying? So
Totally.
I just wonder about that. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And there's a sort of concern about the EITC that it's subsidizing low-wage work in a way that allows employers to pay less than they would counterfactually without the EITC. And I do think that some of the observed labor earnings inequality reduction that we see is actually offset in exactly the way you're describing of people, not aging out, earning out of EITC coverage. And I'll show you, so I showed you a couple slides ago that total pre-tax income is also going up. If you look at so that was pre-tax what I showed you, but if you look at the post-tax figures, which I always, I feel like it just, as soon as you're not just talking about wages, I'm a wages guy, I get that. As soon as you're talking about we're gonna correct for EITC, we're gonna consider all these transfers, it just gets exponentially more complicated. But what you see is there's also been an increase in bottom 50% share, even post-tax, but it's been a little bit slower than what you see pre-tax. And I think some of that is a lot of people were on unemployment benefits following the Great Recession, and then some of it is people leaving EITC coverage. So it's a great question. Yeah, I feel like we were talking about capital income a bit last night, and I feel like it's the easy thing is wages. Everything else just seems like so much harder to me. But maybe that's just because I've been in this world long enough. But yeah, it's a great question. Other questions before we launch in? Great, okay, yeah, so actually, yeah, before we launch in, let me say this is sort of smushing a couple different very much ongoing projects together, somewhat opportunistically. Like, this is all the stuff that I just want to get your thoughts and feedback on, which has already been super, super useful. So this is papers with Clem Apley, who's a terrific PhD student in Harvard sociology. Victoria Zhang, Di Tong, and Su-Yun Ro are all PhD students at MIT Sloan, where I work, and LT Zhang, who's a professor at HBS. And then for this Burning Glass LEHD project, really the primary author, the motive force here is Dylan Nelson, who is a postdoc with us at MIT, University of Michigan Soch grad, and who is critically on the market this fall. So really want to emphasize what great work he's doing and what an exciting set of projects he has. Let me also say this work results from a series of collaborations. You know, I have this hobby of giving talks like this, writing papers, teaching, but true full-time work is just begging people to share labor market data with me. And this project very much reflects the results of that begging. So we're going to see some data from the US Census Bureau and IRS LEHD collaboration, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Occupational Employment Statistics microdata, then two proprietary sources, Glassdoor.com that I already mentioned, and then this Burning Glass job postings that are going to be crucial. And the key thing I want to emphasize is I'm going to be showing some like company names and stuff like I did for Walmart. All of that's coming from these proprietary data. Of course, none of it's coming from the tax records or the sensitive census information. So no jail time and $250,000 fine from me. Okay, so let's get into it. So are we headed back to the 1950s? Well, what did sort of the series of changes look like in the 1940s? Well, one thing that you had was basically like raises from the middle out. This was the period of the so-called rise of the American middle class. You had, as I mentioned, the rise of labor unions. Connected to that was a bunch of sort of within-firm bargaining redistribution. So we know that pay for CEOs and executives plunged during the 1940s and really didn't start recovering until the 1970s. We also see that there's a big compression between how much managers and professionals are paid and how much production workers are paid, all of which is sort of consistent with these new bargaining representatives, industrial labor unions, capturing more firm surplus for workers and taking that from shareholders and from non-union higher level employees. Another key thing that we saw here is that it's driven by raises for production workers more so than raises for workers in the service sector. So it's kind of always the case that this post-war labor capital settlement basically left out a lot of workers in restaurants and retail, workers who were racialized, who were disproportionately women. This was very much a story about sort of the rise of better working conditions for the industrial working class. Another thing that's much more anecdotal, but that I think is probably the case, is that a lot of what we saw was big raises in what were already relatively high-paying firms, what we would today call sort of high-road firms, or the classic example here would be, I'm from outside Detroit, you know, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors. Going back to the 1910s, these were already relatively high-paying manufacturing employers, but starting in the late 1930s and through the 40s and 50s, they became sort of very good jobs, in part thanks to this labor organizing. And a way to sort of like metaphorically remember this is to think of the so-called Treaty of Detroit, this 1950 agreement between the United Auto Workers and General Motors Corporation that basically was like the first long 5-year collective bargaining agreement and institutionalized that workers would get cost of living increases every year under the logic that productivity rising should be shared with production workers. It also gave GM workers pensions and health insurance for the first time, and it sort of ushered in this labor capital cooperation. Okay, so is that what we see today? Well, I'm going to say no. So this chart's just showing for kind of non-white collar occupations how much wages changed for different groups of people. You can see that actually this big increase over the period from 2012 to 2022 has really been concentrated among non-union workers, private sector rather than public sector, and particularly younger workers rather than older workers. So this is not a story about unions suddenly winning much better collective bargaining agreements than they did before. Okay, so let me just zoom in a little bit on this variance chart that I showed before. We're going to separate this into this sort of long period of rising inequality and this more recent last 10 years period. So if you just look at the blue triangles here, this is showing wage changes and hourly terms across the wage distribution. You can see the blue triangles are basically like the classic rising inequality pattern, right? So we've got very large pay increases for workers at the top, and that's decreasing down to about the 70th percentile, decreases more slowly. For workers at the very bottom, for the lowest percentiles of workers, there's basically no increase in pay over this long period. If you look at the red triangles, this most recent 10 years, things look a lot different. So one thing that hasn't changed is the very top. They're still doing great. Don't worry about it. The top 1% has still had a really good 10 years. This is not the kind of inequality that comes from those at the very top doing worse and everybody else doing better. Instead, what's changed is that there's somewhat higher pay increases for those below about the 70th percentile, the bulk of the distribution. But this has been especially stark for the bottom percentiles of the labor market. You see that for the 10th percentile, there's been like a 20% increase in real earnings during this decade, which like way outstrips what they had experienced cumulatively in the 4 decades prior. Yeah, Jeff.
What are we doing with the zeros?
Yeah, so zeros, if you're out of the labor market, you're not here at all. And this is sort of the standard way of studying labor market inequality rather than overall income inequality. Let me say, though, if you were able to include the zeros here, I think this would look even more dramatic, and that's because the labor force participation rate's increasing so much, unemployment rates are declining so much during this period that you have a bunch of people who were zeros coming out of the Great Recession, who then joined the labor market, and actually like that composition change increases observed labor market inequality a bit because you have these marginal workers who are coming back in at low wages. But I think if we included the zeros, this would look even sharper. Great. Okay, so that's what the distribution looks like. If you look at these trends, you can see, yeah, the 90th percentile has continued on with its pay increases. The 50th percentile is doing a little bit better, but not outpacing the 90th. The big switch here is this really rapid wage growth for workers at the bottom of the distribution. Okay, so when we first saw this, we were like, okay, great, this has got to be minimum wage. This is like the classic minimum wage story. You've got big pay increases at the bottom. And look, like it's also the case that a bunch of states were raising their minimum wages during this period, often to levels that were like controversial among academic economists, even those somewhat sympathetic to the minimum wage. And clearly, minimum wage is part of this. So this is just splitting between minimum wage increasing states and states that have no minimum wage. And there's no federal minimum wage increase during this period. And what you can see is that wages grew a little bit faster for those at the bottom in the minimum wage states. But the other thing you should get from this chart is that you still see this bump at the bottom, even in the Alabamas and the Texases, the Mississippis, the places without any minimum wage increases at all, which that suggests to me that this can't be just a minimum wage story. This has got to be something that's sort of more general, some kind of tightening labor markets, increased demand for people at the bottom story that holds across places. And I mean, the other thing you see in the minimum wage states is that there's actually higher growth for people at the top, which again, that's not minimum wage, it's just like these are sort of the rich states, the highly unequal states. So this is sort of giving the minimum wage states the best chance possible, and even then you sort of see this pattern on both sides. Okay, so let's think about this in terms of occupation, which can often be a bit more concrete. So these blue circles are basically showing how wages changed by occupation during that period of rising inequality. You can see, the white-collar folks, the University of Wisconsin faculty are doing great. For blue-collar workers like production, transportation, repair, what you would think of as like middle-wage jobs that used to be like relatively high-paying jobs for workers without a college degree, these 30 years were a disaster. There were like, in real terms, declining wages on average for these occupations. For the lowest wage jobs, food services, health support, these sort of positions, there's sort of small pay increases. Okay, so how's the more recent decade compare here? Well, what you see is that for these jobs in the middle that were facing wage declines, they're actually doing a bit better. But the biggest pay increases have really been for these lowest paid service sector jobs, consistent with what we see in the percentile chart. Okay, another way to look at this is by thinking about how much of the inequality decline has been within firms among coworkers versus average pay differences between firms. So what you can see is that basically the rise in inequality was really driven by increasing pay disparities between firms. And that's also the case for the decline in inequality that we've seen recently. You can see that this sort of leveled off and then even declined a bit. In contrast, inequality among coworkers has even like slightly increased a bit, but has just been pretty flat during this period. So this to me makes me think that we really have to figure out what's going on with firms and think about which firms are raising their pay and which firms are lowering their pay. So enter these slightly sketchy Glassdoor data, which, this is not a government survey. This is not the administrative data. This is just like people going online, filling out reviews of their companies, saying, hey, I get paid X amount. We convinced Glassdoor to give us these data. We've done a bunch of work to try to reweight the data to be representative by geography, by occupation, and by industry. We've also done a lot of work to try to throw out the fake reviews. So there's a lot of people who just go on and say stuff about a company that they don't work at. So I can get into more detail and how we've done that. We've done it imperfectly, but we've gotten rid of some of that. We've sort of, gotten these data as good as we can, but they're still very far from the gold standard type data that you guys are used to thinking about in stratification research. Okay, so why bother? Well, the really cool thing that you can do with the Glassdoor data is instead of following occupations or even worse percentiles over time, you can follow actual jobs and see how wages are changing. Within the Walmart associate job, how much did wages increase over time? Which I think gives us sort of a lot more traction on what's going on here. So this is basically doing that. What we do is, and Glassdoor ends up being mostly large firms, at least that's sort of the subset for which we have enough reviews to really say something. So think of this as mostly large firms. What we've done is we've picked the most common, we've first thrown out all the white collar and managerial jobs. Then we pick the most common job at each firm. So at Walmart, that's going to be the associate's position. At McDonald's, it's going to be a line cook or cashier position or something. Then we've asked, how did wages for that job, defined as a firm by occupation pair, how did wages for that job change over time? We've arrayed that by occupation here. And then we've just split into firm jobs that were relatively low paying at the start of this period versus those that are relatively high paying. What you can see is it's really the lowest paying jobs, even within occupation, that have seen bigger pay increases during this period. It's also the case that it's actually firms that are shrinking rather than growing that are giving bigger pay increases, which again, I think is consistent with these questions of sort of work intensification, doing more with less kind of stuff. Okay, to make this more concrete, this chart just arrays the x-axis is basically whether you're a relatively high-paying or relatively low-paying employer, conditional on your sort of main occupation. And then the y-axis just gives the annualized log real wage change during this period. So what you can see is that a lot of the big companies that we think of as great employers, so General Motors, Ford, USPS in the public sector, these are actually relatively high-paying employers for their occupation. But they're not the employers where we've seen really rapid pay increases during this period. Instead, it's sort of the bad guys of discussions of labor markets. It's the Walmarts and Meijer and contractors like Sodexo and Securitas. These are really the firms that are driving these big pay increases for low-wage workers during this period. But the logging and percentage terms, elasticities, can cover up all sorts of sins. In this case, it's actually a little bit misleading. So this is just showing basically nominal wage changes on both sides. So this is how much your job started out paying this says 2015. I think it's actually 2012. But anyway, how much your job started out paying, and then how big of an increase cumulatively over the period it got. What you can see is that basically, a lot of people were getting $5 nominal wage increases over this period. If you start out at $8 an hour, that is like, a 40% pay increase. That is a life-changing, huge pay increase. Obviously, it's going to be, less of a big pay increase if you start out at $20 an hour. Then it declines a bit. This ends up being at like the 60th percentile. So, that's the thing to keep in mind is that like a lot of this is sort of relative changes, really big percentage pay increases for jobs at the bottom, but even jobs closer to the median did have serious nominal increases. Yeah.
Sorry, I can't see super well, but
Yeah.
like what time period is this?
Yeah, so this is ending in 2012, and the slide wants to convince you that it's starting in 2015. I think it's actually starting in 2012 and that that's a typo, but it's one of those two periods. Yeah. Okay, so I've just like thrown a lot at you, and there's not some deep theoretical point here. This is just like all of these charts that I've been trying to think through, and I'm curious about what your guys' reaction is. But there is a common through thread here in that I think the answer to the question of whether we're back to the 1950s is no based on this. So it seems like the biggest increases are really in like the 10th to 30th percentile rather than in the middle of the distribution. The big change in inequality trends is really about between firm differences rather than redistribution among coworkers within firm. It's also the case that this is not driven by formal collective bargaining agreements becoming much more generous, if anything, the opposite. It's really driven by services rather than sort of industrial production work. And we're seeing that it's really like the lowest paying, shrinking large firms that are raising wages rather than like the really high-paying leader firms that seem to have been doing it in the 1940s. And I think this is important in that like one optimistic story you could have is like, wow, some like dynamic startup figured out a way to reorganize work and pay workers more, and they've been really successful. There's some new great idea here. I think that's not what's happening. I think if anything, there's sort of old ideas that arguably are diffusing down through a broader set of jobs and a broader set of firms. And that's what I want to study next, is basically whether diffusion of these different work practices might support higher pay for workers at the bottom. Yeah.
So if they're shrinking large firms, has the proportion of people that are working for large firms changed over time as well?
Good question. So the Glassdoor data doesn't show that in general firms are shrinking, just splitting between shrinking and growing firms. I do not know the answer to that, but it's a good
It
question.
goes back to like the rise of gig work and
Totally.
the hustle economy and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Maybe
No, it's a great question. So I'll say, in general, the rise of gig work thing I'm skeptical about, and that the Bureau of Labor Statistics contingent work surveys for a long time have shown this flat trend. For a while, we thought that the admin data looking at 1099s was showing a different story of, it's been a big increase in 1099 filers. Andy Guerin at University of Illinois has a great, really detailed look at that, where he got the microdata from the IRS and basically finds that that apparent increase is largely people on EITC, and it's very suspiciously around kinks of increasing returns that people are filing. So after seeing that paper, I'm a little skeptical that there's been a big, wide-ranging increase in gig work. But I think that you could still imagine a situation where like you have a big expansion of conventional employment at smaller firms, and I don't know whether that's happening. It's a good question. Yeah.
Just that maybe this is too detailed a question, but that
No.
just the last fact seems surprising.
Yeah.
It seems like an obvious explanation is just a selection story, that the first workers that leave are the least experienced, lowest paid workers within position. Does it survive sort of individual fixed effects or something?
So I'll show you, we're gonna do a bunch on selection once we're into the LEHD stuff. It's hard to do with the Glassdoor data because some people fill out reviews multiple times, but you've got to wonder like what they're doing and why they're filling them out multiple times. So I think it's, I think it's totally consistent with the worst workers leaving and then the remaining wages being higher. I think like when you think about the particular firms here, it's a little harder. Like it's a lot of like legacy retailers and stuff where I don't know, like they're sort of high turnover firms to begin with. I I think, yeah, some of it could be they're just like facing a tight labor market, so they're dealing with more turnover. That story, though, would make me think, actually, it's the lower quality workers who are left behind who aren't sort of switching up and climbing the career ladder in this tight labor market. But I don't know, it's a great question, and we'll be all over selection in a bit. But yeah, for this, just descriptive, yeah.
Sorry, maybe I misunderstood, but in a previous graph where you split occupations by blue collar and white collar occupations, you described like a big relative increase in kind of like the low end blue collar jobs. But
Yeah.
I would like you to comment a little bit on the relative decrease in the white collar jobs. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so let me be clear. Again, don't worry about the 1%. You're worried about the 1%. Don't be. So, to be clear, this is the cumulative change in hourly wages across 2 periods. One period is 30 years long, one period's 10 years long. So these guys, although they have less of a pay increase in this recent period than they did in the previous period, they're actually still doing better in annualized terms. So it's been a really good 10 years. Oops, sorry, I'm breaking stuff here now. So it's been a really good 10 years even for white collar workers. The change though is in relative terms. That like now the increases that they've seen are similar to the increases that production workers, et cetera, have seen, and actually a little bit lower for than what food service workers are seeing. So don't look at this. This visualization bugs me a little bit because yeah, it looks like health practitioners are getting smaller wages, but don't take that away from this. Everybody's getting pay increases, and in annualized terms, everybody's doing better than they were on average in the prior period. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
What has struck me so far is that there has been no mention at all of any other countries.
Yeah.
And in 2 senses. One is there were big changes in poverty in the rest of the world that
Yeah.
are related to, in important ways, what was happening at the low end of the wage scale in
Yeah.
the States. The second point that's more related to what we're talking about now is, in the 1950s, there had just been a major war, and the manufacturing capacity of our major trading partners had largely been gone.
Yep. Yep.
And there were tariffs.
Yeah.
Right? And
And
then
immigration
in the 90s,
control.
China comes into the WTO, and blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, and there's all that kind of stuff. Some of that seems to be relevant to some of the, the going back to the 50s question.
Totally. Yeah, let me say a couple things on that. So one is just on other countries. I would love to know what's been happening in detail in lots of other countries. Canada, I know you've seen basically uniform wage increases during the last 5 years, unlike what you see in the US. So already very similar. Our neighbors to the north, it looks a bit different. Israel has seen sort of a long decline in inequality, even going back to the Great Recession. I'd love to know UK, Germany, Sweden, et cetera. I don't know the sources well enough. Okay, so in terms of other stuff, my general answer to you is I think there's a lot that we don't know about ultimate causes of these tight labor markets that we're seeing, both on the supply and demand side. So Nick Bloom has a nice paper sort of revisiting the China shock stuff with it's like 2010 to 2015 economic census data, where he finds it seems like the China shock has maybe run its course, which would be consistent with the story you're telling of there just aren't that many more peasants in China to go do cheap factory work and compete with American workers. Another thing that's happening here is from the Great Recession, you have a big stabilization in the inflow of low-wage immigrants from low-wage countries. Again, could be sort of similar to the 1950s era. The third thing that you have is just the baby boomers retiring, which I'm sure there's demographers in the room here who know better than I do, but the baby boomers are a visible hump in that age distribution. And certainly from the COVID era, you see lots of people the 54 to 65 window, a bunch of people retiring early in a way that is reducing labor supply. Now, exactly the distributional effects of each of those different changes in labor demand, labor supply, I think each of those should be their own paper. But I totally agree that there's a bunch of international context here that might be first order important, might be second order important, but is, I would say, importantly flowing through this, where are tight labor markets, where's demand at the low end coming from question. Yeah. Thanks.
Most examples that you've given have been these sort of in-person service jobs that are not about, like automation or they have to be in person. When you work at McDonald's, you have to be there.
Yep.
And same with like, the direct codes and stuff. So, I mean,
Yeah, and
to the extent that people are substituting across,
totally.
those jobs versus jobs that
The labor markets are going to be interconnected, absolutely. So yeah, totally. To emphasize, these are really these like in-person services are really where we've seen the biggest increases. Though note, like the biggest reversals are really in these production transportation type jobs where like, although those aren't the biggest absolute wage increases, just the difference from the rising inequality period to the recent one is so stark. And that's somewhere where the China shock and other sort of international stories could still be quite important. And in terms of these low-wage services, the immigration story could be quite central there. These are a lot of the kinds of jobs that immigrants from low-wage countries were doing over the last 40 years. Yeah.
I've been thinking about like self-checkouts and stuff. How do you think about that here? Because while those service jobs are in person, what a cashier is now is different than what a cashier was less than 10 years ago. Like you're almost in a manager kind of role.
So that's exactly where we're headed, which is within occupation, how are these jobs, how are the tasks that people are doing actually changing? On technology specifically, one prominent story, 2012 to 2014, was about technological unemployment, a sort of secular decline in the number of jobs. I think like, at least cyclically, that has not been the story of the last 10 years. That's not the story right now. But it's very plausible to me that tight labor markets are also pushing employers to think through these different margins. Like Starbucks famously a few months ago, in part in response to this union organizing drive, announced that it was going to start installing these machines to do the fancy syrups and mixing and stuff that workers were complaining about, which that would be like a sort of classic labor substitution story where like, yeah, the job becomes more complex in a way because you're dealing with the machine, but maybe you need fewer people. But yeah, let's get into that because that's very much the sort of stuff that like we're hoping to measure by using these job descriptions from online job postings. Okay, so here, this next part now is going to feel more like a paper presentation rather than just like me saying stuff. What's going on with work reorganization? Well, I mentioned before that in the so-called Great Compression, the first Great Compression in the 1940s and 1950s, there were all of these changes related to the rise of labor unions, collective bargaining, bureaucratization of employment. In the 1970s and 1980s, when all of that started falling apart, it sort of created this like interdisciplinary cottage industry of economists and sociologists and management scholars proposing kind of alternatives, saying, okay, like Fordism, mass production is dead. This is the way that we're gonna organize work to get prosperity and shared economic growth. And so this is a list of some of these. I'm not gonna take a position on like who was right, whose proposal is most compelling. I'm instead gonna sort of think more narrowly about what tasks are allocated to which workers and which jobs down the lines of the self-checkout question. And I'm gonna set aside like, this general research area talks a lot about like training and specific compensation structures and incentives and talks about a whole range of things that go beyond just this task, work content, work organization topic that I'm gonna zero in on. So what do I mean by this? Well, luckily there's some like really impressive case studies looking at ways that employers have figured out alternative approaches to the organization of work and the design of jobs. And I'm just gonna lump these into two broad categories. One's gonna be about sort of giving more complex and technical tasks to frontline low-wage workers. And one's gonna be about sort of increasing the discretion and autonomy that workers have to do their jobs. So on the technical complexity side, a sort of classic example is auto parts line workers who are sort of doing a repetitive thing throughout their workday, having them also be responsible for some sort of light maintenance tasks so that if the line breaks down, you don't have to wait for a building trades guy to come in and fix it. You can have the person on the spot repair the line more quickly. Another example, like on the discretion autonomy side, using fewer scripts in customer service. So if you've ever been sort of on the phone with somebody at a call center and you get sort of trapped in a script and in a flow chart that they're going through, one proposal is figuring out sort of a broader range of customer problems that customer service reps are given discretion over how to handle rather than just sticking with this the script. And now, most of this work has sort of been done with an eye to let's increase productivity, are there benefits to the firm and the employing organization? But there's also a lot of reason to think that these sort of changes would be associated with increased pay for the workers doing these jobs. So again, we're going to skip work intensification today, but increased discretion, you could have a classic sort of efficiency wage, turnover cost type story. Like, look, you need to pay workers more so that they'll use their autonomy and discretion to actually do work tasks in service of the best interests of employers. And on technical complexity, you could imagine sort of a couple different stories. One is that like they're actually picking up some non-firm specific skills on the job through doing these tasks. Another slightly less optimistic one is like maybe the line worker, the auto parts line worker, like already knows these maintenance skills, but just doesn't have any way to signal to other employers that they can effectively do this on the job. And so that it could just be sort of a signaling thing where you have some like underused human capital on the part of workers that then once you upgrade this job, other employers see that this guy can do this thing, and then that's going to increase the outside option that worker has. Okay, but before we spring into action, proposing, yeah, this is how we should reorganize work, there's big limitations of these case studies. As always, they're like, some firm, this was often working, and so they allowed a researcher to come in and study this. Maybe they're really quirky firms. Another way that people have studied tasks and wages is I was talking to somebody about ONET earlier. David Otter and others have sort of pioneered basically classifying occupations at the labor market level according to the tasks that they're composed of, measured through this ONET database. Now, one problem with that is that you're then stuck at sort of an occupation level mode of analysis, whereas we really want to get into within occupation variation in how these jobs are designed. And the reason why I think that's important is like, that's often the relevant margin for decision makers on this. So to give an example, like, it's rare that an employer is deciding like, okay, should I hire a doctor with this complex set of tasks, or should I hire a medical assistant with this set of tasks? Instead, the person's probably deciding like, okay, I've got to hire a medical assistant. How exactly should I design this job? What tasks should be within the jurisdiction of this job versus other jobs? Another way that people have studied work organization is by using establishment surveys, where you basically like send out a survey to some HR person or some manager, and you say like, hey, do you guys do cross-training? Do you guys set goals? What's the sort of work organization look like in your firm? There's a bunch in the high-performance work systems vein doing this. More recently, the structured management practice literature, if you guys have read any of this, is sort of, it's all about like sending surveys to workplaces to have somebody fill it out. Now, the problem with this is like you don't get anything about like within workplace heterogeneity. So you just have a sense that like every worker at that establishment is treated in the exact same way and doing the same sort of work, which is very often going to be misleading. It's also, unless you match it to some sort of admin data, you really can't get a handle on these worker sorting questions that we're gonna focus on here. Okay, so ideally we'd see across many firms how tasks in specific jobs are changing, and link that to earnings for workers who are entering those jobs. How are we doing on time? Like 20 more minutes, or? And yeah, again, jump in if you have questions, because yeah, I don't know how much Q&A time we're gonna have at the end, but we'll go quick. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, I already mentioned we're gonna match these online job postings to workers in the administrative data, and there's this sort of intermediate step where we're just gonna survey people, asking them to code these like 2,000 different individual tasks and job requirements so that we have some dimension reduction and can stick some variables in a regression that would be interpretable. Let me just give a quick example here. So this is 2 job postings, both for a Sodexo line cook position. In 2014, the Sodexo line cook position involved cooking, food prep, some basic physical abilities. In 2019, you'll be relieved to see it still involved cooking and food prep and some physical abilities. It's still a line cook job, but you can see that Sodexo also added some more stuff. So they said, like, yeah, you also have to do some work area maintenance, a kind of more complex technical task. And then they said you also have to do hazard analysis critical control point, which I had to Google, but is basically like a food safety protocol of not leaving food outside the refrigerator too long, cooking it at high enough temperatures, that typically you need some formal training to do this.
2014.
Back here, salmonella all day, no problem for Sodexo. Hopefully you guys have Aramark or something here at Wisconsin. Okay, so what we want to know is whether basically earnings were higher for a worker starting in 2019 under this more complex job versus one starting in 2014. But the neat thing here is we're not going to be stuck in case study world. We're not just studying Walmart, not just studying Sodexo. We can see for a bunch of different jobs how they're developing over time, how they're moving through sort of a task space as these jobs get reorganized. Okay, so to do this, we do these 2 surveys where we just ask people, hey, like, here's a bunch of tasks. We'd like you to categorize these according to some simple categories. In the first set of questions, we say, look, just like, is this a pretty simple task? Is it pretty complex, but typically can be learned on the job? Is it complex, but usually needs some higher education? And I'll say, basically, people interpret needing higher education as just like more technical tasks, which I think like often actually is not the case. We had this long training thing and had people, respondents do this testing stuff, but basically they like any computer programming languages they think of as like, oh yeah, that's college stuff, that's off the job. So, you know, with some caveats, but I think this is at least sort of capturing some real differences between like more complex and more simple tasks. Then the second survey, we asked a sort of more sociology of work set of questions about like, is this a task that's pretty rule-bound and easily supervised? Or is it a task that is pretty constrained by like social interactions with customers or clients or something? Or does it imply a lot of discretion and autonomy, a lot of ownership over your work, as the Walmart press release writers would say? Sorry, yeah, this is a little blurry for those in the back. But anyway, these are just all like tasks arrayed across these dimensions. Okay, so one thing we can do with that is we're then able to code all of these job postings according to these survey encodings, and we can say like, okay, you know, among grocery sales clerks, are more complex jobs paying more? Indeed they are. Whole Foods is paying more than Dollar Express and also has sort of more complex tasks described in its posting. But of course, like, there's huge firm heterogeneity here. Whole Foods has a totally different customer base, a totally different strategy than Dollar Express, and also this question about worker selection and skill differences. You know, we're measuring work organization using job postings. So this is exactly like we're measuring it at the selection point. We should expect that different kinds of workers would be applying to these jobs as they get upgraded. So like the thing you should really worry about is that maybe it's the case that like although Dollar Express is paying less than Whole Foods is really only hiring people with an associate's degree. And so if Dollar Express shifted into the Whole Foods world, maybe we would actually be reducing opportunities for those at the very bottom of the labor market. Maybe this would be a kind of credentialing or like stealth credentialing process that would actually reduce opportunities for those at the very bottom. Yeah.
I'm also wondering, like, you showed the example of the tasks, and presumably some tasks are being reallocated from a different job to
Totally.
job, and so sort of like, there's probably a job disappearing
Yeah.
somewhere, and are you sort of thinking about that?
This is on our list. It's a little hard to get at. Think of what we have with the job postings is basically the flow, but not the stock of tasks. So there's a little bit of measurement error involved in this, but it's on our list to basically distinguish between cases where a task was already being done by some job and got moved downward in the organizational chart and the hierarchy, versus one where it's like a new task like hazard analysis critical control point maybe that wasn't being done before and that has newly appeared. We've not done that yet, but it's a great idea. Yeah.
Along the same lines, since you're essentially using the nodal job at each of these firms, wouldn't it be worth looking at like what has disappeared across your measurement period?
Yeah, so here we're not going to be in the modal job world. I'll show you in a second. We're going to be using every firm by occupation pair that we possibly can. And I'll show you a bit on occupational heterogeneity too in a sec, but yeah, we're including everything in what we're about to do. Okay, so how do we connect these postings to the LEHD data? So, like always, like in presentations, I've been talking for a while. All of this that I've talked about is like 5% of the time that went into this project. Like this slide is the other 95% of just trying to match these two data sets together. But there's really only like two things that I want you to get from this. One is that like it's just hard to match the burning glass employer information into the business register employer information. They're just like, those employer names are often very different in ways that are hard to predict. Took a lot of work to figure out the best ways to do that. The second issue, as some of you might know, unlike any civilized country with good administrative data, the US does not have occupation within the LEHD administrative data apparatus. So what we have to do is match in the 2 to 3% sample from the American Community Survey to get people who are starting a new job around the time that they happen to be sampled in the ACS so that we can say something about what their occupation is. What this is going to let us do is basically compare these two people, pick 313 and 248, who both start jobs at MIT. One starts at MIT when this job, the gender job, involves less autonomy and discretion. One starts later when that job involves more discretion. And we're going to ask whether this guy in the higher discretion job is paid more. Then we're also going to ask whether this person's sort of more positively selected, whether they might be coming from a higher paying job to begin with. Okay, so the big story here is we start out with a lot of job starts and end up with very few. A big cut here is we're only using this ACS sample, so we're only looking at the people who were filling out the ACS around when they switched jobs. That knocks us down to about 3.2 million job starts. And then when we match firms to burning glass, for what I'm about to show you, this is like we're being really stringent about false positives, so we're only using the matches that we're really confident about, and that means we're losing about 2/3 of the job starts because their firms are hard to match for any number of reasons. Then we also require that the post and the start be in the same county, same occupation, and within 2 quarters of hire. So from literally millions of job starts, we end up with about 100,000 job starts in the final analytical sample. I'm still going to try to convince you that this is like an interesting analytical sample to study because sort of for the first time, we've matched administrative earnings record to the actual job postings that they were hired under, and we're going to learn a lot from that. What I'm going to show you is 2010 to 2015 data. The new batch of LEHD just came out a month ago. We now have 2015 to 2021. That solves a lot of our sample size problems, but we don't have those results through disclosure yet. Okay, so the analysis, I'm not even going to show you an equation because the model is super simple. We're just going to be predicting the quarterly earnings for the second quarter that somebody is in a job, so the first sort of full quarter that we can be confident about seeing their earnings. And we're going to try to look at the same job by using a firm by detailed SOC code fixed effect. Then we're also going to adjust for sort of time-varying local labor market conditions by including a labor market fixed effect as calendar quarter by MSA by a broader occupational category. And so that's going to let us say, like, okay, when a job's tasks change, what happens to earnings for new hires into that job compared to the earnings that prior hires were making? Then we're going to adjust for selection, human capital differences in a couple ways. We're going to use sort of basic Mincer and demographic controls. Then we're going to try to do basically like a souped up pre-treatment fixed effecty thing where we're going to use the longitudinal data in the LEHD to say, okay, we're going to take your average prior earnings, but then for people who might be on like an upward or downward trajectory of earnings, we're also going to just control for the slope of their prior earnings, and then we're going to control for non-employment. We can't distinguish unemployment from out of the labor force in our data, so just think of this as like, you don't have an LEHD job, we're going to control for that. It's going to let us ask, okay, in the same job, the same firm by occupation, adjusting for labor market conditions and worker selection, how does work reorganization affect earnings? Okay, here's how it affects earnings. So model 1 is giving like a totally unsaturated model. And what you can see is that like by just including these task predictors, you're explaining a lot of variation in earnings. This is like similar to if you include education dummies, age squared, the Mincer stuff. Earnings are really consistently varying with the task content of jobs as measured through these online job postings. However, in model 2, once you add the occupation by firm fixed effect, you see those estimates attenuate really substantially. This shouldn't be surprising. Like, occupation is capturing a lot of variation in tasks. Firm is capturing a bunch more variation. Crossing them is really, we're really trying to look at just that within estimate of, the same job changing its task content over time. So then if you look at model 3, once we add the labor market control, what you see is that basically like an increase in technical or complex tasks is associated with an increase in earnings. This is like 0 to 1 here. So if you think of like variation observed in our data, if it goes from like no complex tasks to like 20% of the tasks listed are complex, you get about a 3% increase in quarterly earnings. And it looks similar for increased discretion and autonomy, maybe about a 2% increase in earnings. But then when you go from model 3 to model 4, which is where we add the human capital and selection controls, you can see that that takes out about half of the effect of increased, more complex tasks. So this suggests that when you increase the complexity of tasks in these job postings, it really is selecting for higher human capital workers. You don't see much change when you add more autonomy or discretion. And so these are similar models, but just instead of predicting pay, we're going to predict those human capital controls to give you a sense of how exactly selection is changing. What you can see is that basically you end up hiring people who have substantially higher prior pay, who are coming from higher paying jobs, and also people who are more likely to have a college degree. We don't see selection shifting by gender or by racialized minority status. And again, when you increase discretion and autonomy, you really don't see much of a change in selection at all. Okay, so from those tables, you might feel like you've learned something, and we felt like we had learned something. But unfortunately, there's just like a ton of occupational heterogeneity here. So, if you just look at production jobs, you can see that autonomy and discretion really doesn't matter much at all. But increasing complex technical tasks does. For clerical, which ends up being sort of admin assistants and customer service reps, you see both matter. And then for services, which I've talked about a lot here, really adding the complex technical stuff doesn't matter much. It's all about discretion. And again, like we get down to small sample sizes here. That's why this new batch of more recent data is really helpful for us. And one sort of problem with interpreting these results is that some of this is because basically these coded variables refer to different tasks for these different occupations. So adding more technical tasks in manufacturing means adding different tasks than adding that in a service sector position. So some of it's that, and then some of it is just sort of like deeper occupational context of like these are different kinds of jobs, so there's going to be different effects. But anyway, as often in social science, turns out there's a bunch of heterogeneity behind these point estimates. Okay, let me wrap up quickly. So hopefully I've convinced you that labor market inequality has stopped growing during the last decade, but it's mostly due to pay rising at the bottom. Seems to be some sort of tight labor market thing rather than like, a revitalization of labor unions or some other kind of more durable change in the labor market. This makes me worried that this sort of pause in rising inequality could in fact turn out to be quite fragile. I also suggest that increasing task technical complexity and discretion or autonomy increases earnings within jobs, but that there's a ton of heterogeneity here that we need to dig into more before we make really strong claims about it. So a couple sort of theory things I've been thinking about with us, mostly for the sociologists in the room. One is that just like basically all of sociology is in one way or another about explaining inequality and explaining cumulative advantage. We have like much weaker theoretical resources for understanding what drives inequality reduction, what interrupts cumulative advantage. We have some, but I think much less. So I think one thing that's really interesting for thinking about labor markets over the last 10 years is thinking about what sort of theories we might develop to account for the good news, account for an interruption in these inequality increasing mechanisms. Second thing, in my little world of research, of people studying organizations and inequality, the majority of that work is really about understanding inequality within organizations among coworkers, why some people get paid more, why some people get paid less. And that really is not the story either for the recent rise in inequality or the stabilization and decline. It's really what we need to do is understand between firm pay differences, why some firms pay more than others. And I also want to suggest that it might be worth thinking in stratification more broadly, less about sort of how workers get allocated across job titles, and more about sort of how those job titles come to be what they are to begin with, and think about sort of shifting organization of work, reallocation of tasks across these jobs, which is what we're trying to do in this talk. Okay, so very last thing, is rising inequality over? I don't know. I think it's very much depends on what policymakers and employers and workers and unions do right now. I think in a lot of ways we have sort of this brief window of opportunity thanks to this long set of tight labor markets that we've had where those of us who have things to say about this, I hope you all say them to policymakers and employers and others, because I think this is a moment where a lot of people are thinking about what's going on in the low wage labor market, much more so than in prior times. Two sort of key questions here. One is whether these gains at the bottom can be locked in and made less fragile. Second is whether rising pay can be spread up toward the median worker more than it has previously. And I want to suggest that these sort of work reorganization, how jobs are designed questions could be a really important component of contributing to this. So thank you, guys. Yeah, great. Yeah.
I was sort of thinking about the mechanism here, since you're seeing that within these pay advantages and accumulation, it's workers with higher levels of human capital or already had that higher pay signaling going into these higher paying jobs. To what extent do you think you'll be able to tease out, or at least in a future research project, or what information is already there, how much of that is their ability to move up in the world versus this is just an effect of a tight labor market? And minimum wage workers don't like to be screwed over by their bosses, and so they make those changes more easily.
Yeah, so how much of this is sort of workers moving across firms, you mean, or?
Yeah, how much is it driven by individual laborers' ability to negotiate and move into higher paying roles versus just this is an effect of labor market conditions, so it's giving at this fragility?
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I would say it's, at this point, seems to be mostly these tight labor market conditions. And that's part of why I think this stuff's so interesting, is figuring out are employers actually, are there ways that they could change what their workplaces look like to sort of lock this in? But I think at this point that is more like a normative statement on my part than a descriptive one. I think a lot of employers are just trying to keep their head above water, trying to deal with high turnover, trying to attract workers, putting out fires basically, rather than making these sort of longer term changes in work organization in the way Walmart and some others have. Yeah.
So, I have a question related to the slides you showed that some states have increased the minimum wage and other states didn't. So I was wondering if that some spillover effects exists there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think it's a great question, especially with, since I work recently on sort of national wage setting by large firms, and you could imagine that firms could respond to minimum wage change by saying, look, we're going to increase everybody nationally to the California level. It's possible. I think there's not great research on that yet, but could be.
For me, I'm thinking if it's Walmart, it has markets in different states, and some states have their minimum wage increase, and it probably affects Walmart within the company.
Totally, yeah, it could be possible, and gets back to this sort of firm size question of well, what's going on among smaller firms versus bigger firms, and yeah, should look into that more. Yeah.
I just wanted to go back. So what you couldn't look in Glassdoor was job intensification.
That's what we're working on. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I was just thinking about how, at least from the interaction with server workers service stuff, that's been a huge shift.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of the story, and I think, and it's basically a compensating differential, a job disamenities story that like could make some of this like apparent decline in like still a decline in earnings inequality, but is it a decline in job utility inequality or something? And yeah, I think that's super crucial. I'm really excited about like basically we're using these like text job reviews that people fill out and developing word dictionaries to capture like. It's, a lot of work, people are stressed out, this kind of stuff. I think it's, again, an example where, like, in standard surveys, we can measure, like, number of hours, but we can't measure much beyond that. We can't measure, like, how stressed out somebody is, whether they're, like, running from station to station, whereas with the sort of Glassdoor data for all its other problems, we can get at that sort of, like, subjective worker experience of their jobs in a way that could be changing and could be important for this stuff. Yeah.
Last question.
So you're talking about tight labor markets, tight low-wage labor markets.
Yeah.
Is an explanation, but is that an explanation, or is it just another way of renaming a phenomenon of high wages?
Totally, low unemployment.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, so I guess the question is, if it's tight, if that's the explanation, then what's driving the tight labor market?
Totally, and I think this gets back to Jeff's question of like, well, is this decline in trade? Is it, fewer low-wage immigrants coming in? And yeah, I agree, and I think like that is, for this presentation, I was sort of just bracketing that and saying, okay, there's tight labor markets, let's figure out like, what might employers be doing in this context.
It's like a cyclical thing, but this isn't really cyclical, right? Yeah.
Totally, I mean, it's at least
Could be,
partially
I guess.
cyclical, but
Yeah.
like, it's been a long cycle,
Yeah.
and the COVID recovery was very quick, in part because of policy stuff and other things. But yeah, I think there's like a bunch of sort of more demography or labor economics-y papers to write about like what are the underlying supply and demand changes here that, I hope more people will work on that, and I don't have a great explanation for like, this is the most important thing, this is the second most important thing. It's more like, these are 5 things that could matter, and we still don't have a great answer on it. Great, thank you guys.